The moment Lucy Morgan threw her dead fiancé's ring into the Red River, she swore on her mother's grave that she would never let another man make promises he could not keep, and she meant every single word of it right up until the afternoon Timothy Mercer rode into Caldwell, Kansas, with mud on his boots, a split lip from a bar fight in Wichita, and the most inconvenient pair of honest brown eyes she had ever had the misfortune of looking directly into. It was the spring of 1878, and Caldwell sat at the edge of the Kishom Trail like a town that had not yet decided whether it wanted to be civilized or wild. The cattle drives had made it rich and rowdy in equal measure, and the main street ran long and dusty between a row of saloons, a general store, a post office, and the tidy little boarding house run by Mrs. Eleanor Hatch, who believed in three things above all else: punctual meals, honest labor, and the good Lord's provision. Lucy had been staying at the boarding house for 6 weeks now, ever since she arrived from St. Louis with 2 carpet bags, a broken heart she refused to discuss, and a skill with a needle that had already made her something of a necessity to the women of Caldwell. She had set up a small seamstress operation in the back room of the boarding house, sewing shirts and mending skirts and hemming trousers for the cowboys who came through town with money burning holes in their pockets, and no mothers around to remind them that a man ought to be presentable. She liked the work. It kept her hands busy and her mind quiet, and it gave her the kind of independence that felt like fresh air after years of being told what she ought to want. She was 24 years old, sharp-tongued and soft-hearted in a combination that she had learned to hide from strangers, and she had absolutely no interest in being anyone's wife. She had been engaged once, to a man named Robert Kane back in St. Louis, a merchant who spoke beautifully about the future and had a habit of quietly dismantling every piece of it. He had gambled away their savings, borrowed against a house they did not own, and then had the spectacular bad grace to get himself killed in a duel over a card game 3 weeks before the wedding. She had stood at his graveside wearing her grief like a polite coat and feeling underneath it, with a guilt she could not quite name, an enormous and terrible relief. She had sold everything she could, paid off what debts she was able to, and bought a train ticket as far west as her remaining money could carry her. That had been Caldwell, Kansas, in the early spring of 1878, and she had decided that was good enough. Timothy Mercer arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in the second week of May, and Lucy first saw him from the window of her sewing room, where she was letting out the seams of a Sunday coat for old Reverend Whittle. The man came up the main street on a big roan horse, sitting easy in the saddle the way men who had grown up on horses always did, as if the animal and the rider were simply one continuous thing. He was somewhere around 27 or 28, tall and lean with dark hair that curled a little at the ends from the dust and heat, and the kind of jaw that looked like it had been carved by someone who had strong opinions about the matter. He had clearly been in some kind of altercation recently. His lip was swollen on one side, and there was a faint bruise developing under his left cheekbone, but he was riding into town as though none of that was any particular inconvenience. He stopped in front of the boarding house, swung down from the horse with fluid ease, tied the roan to the post, and looked up at the building with the assessing expression of a man who had slept under the stars enough times to genuinely appreciate a proper roof. That was when he glanced toward the window, and Lucy, who had not meant to be staring, found herself looking directly into a pair of brown eyes that were warm and alert and faintly amused, because he had clearly caught her watching him. She let the curtain fall back into place with a snap, and returned her attention to Reverend Whittle's Sunday coat with a great deal more focus than the garment strictly required. She heard him come into the boarding house downstairs, heard Mrs. Hatch's voice going through the usual questions, and then heard the floorboards creak on the staircase. His room, she gathered from the sounds, was 2 doors down from hers on the second floor. She saw him properly at supper that evening. Mrs. Hatch ran a table d'hôte, which meant that everyone in the house ate together at the big table in the dining room at 6 o'clock sharp, and lateness was regarded as a personal affront. There were 6 boarders in all at that time. There was Lucy. There was old Reverend Whittle, who was waiting for a permanent posting. There were the Dalton sisters, Martha and Grace, who were schoolteachers newly arrived from Ohio. There was a land surveyor named Horace Kincaid, who was mapping the county for the railroad. And there was now Timothy Mercer, who appeared at the table at 5:58 with his face clean, his hair combed, and a clean shirt that someone had attempted to iron, though not very successfully. Mrs. Hatch introduced him. He was a cattle rancher, she said, from a spread about 40 miles south of Caldwell. He had come to town to hire hands for the summer drive and to conduct some business at the land office. "Mr. Mercer," Mrs. Hatch said, gesturing around the table, "this is Reverend Whittle, Miss Dalton and Miss Dalton, Mr. Kincaid and Miss Morgan." Timothy Mercer nodded to each of them in turn with the quiet courtesy of a man who had been raised right, and when he got to Lucy he said, "Miss Morgan," with a small, perfectly contained smile that told her he absolutely remembered the curtain. "Mr. Mercer," she said, in a tone designed to convey that she had already forgotten the whole incident, which was so obviously untrue that Martha Dalton gave Lucy a curious sideways look from across the table. Supper was roast beef and potatoes and biscuits, and the conversation moved the way it always did at Mrs. Hatch's table, touching on local matters, the progress of the cattle season, the new schoolhouse being built on the east end of town, and the general state of the territory. Timothy Mercer listened more than he talked, which Lucy noted with a reluctant degree of approval, because, in her experience, men who talked less tended to mean more of what they actually said. When he did speak, it was direct and unhurried, and he had a low, even voice that carried without any effort. After supper, while Mrs. Hatch was clearing the dishes and the others were drifting toward the parlor, Lucy stepped outside onto the narrow porch at the back of the house that faced the open grassland behind the town. She liked this porch in the evenings. The sky over Kansas in late spring was extraordinary, a tremendous vault of color going from deep orange at the horizon to a blue overhead so pure it looked like something had recently polished it. She stood there with her hands folded on the porch railing, breathing the cool air that smelled of grass and distant dust, and she heard the screen door open behind her. She knew without turning around who it was. "Fine evening," Timothy said, coming to stand at the far end of the porch railing, giving her a comfortable amount of space. "It is," she agreed, without turning her head. A moment of comfortable silence passed. Then he said, "That bruise on your expression is going to leave a mark, Miss Morgan. I don't believe I've done anything to deserve quite that level of suspicion in the first 2 hours of an acquaintance." She turned and looked at him then, because the remark was unexpected and rather more perceptive than she had anticipated. He was leaning against the porch post with his arms crossed loosely, watching the sunset with an easy patience, and the evening light was doing something entirely unfair to those brown eyes. "I am not suspicious," she said. "I am private." "All right," he said agreeably, as if he found this distinction perfectly reasonable. Another silence passed. Below the porch, a mockingbird was cycling through its repertoire with tremendous enthusiasm. "What happened to your face?" she asked, surprising herself. He touched his jaw briefly without self-consciousness. "Bar fight in Wichita. It was not my bar fight originally, but a friend needed help with it." "And did the friend win?" "Won," he said, "but I am using that term loosely. It was more of a mutual conclusion." He glanced at her with a faint smile. "You're a seamstress." "I am. Mrs. Hatch mentioned it. She said you're the best needlewoman in the county. Mrs. Hatch is generous." "She doesn't seem the type to be generous with the truth," he said. Lucy found the corner of her own mouth betraying her slightly, and she looked back at the sunset before he could see it. "Good night, Mr. Mercer," she said, and went back inside. She lay awake for a while that night, looking at the ceiling of her room and feeling deeply annoyed with herself for no specific reason she could point to. Timothy Mercer had come to Caldwell for 10 days. That was what Mrs. Hatch said, and 10 days was a reasonable amount of time to hire hands and sort out land matters, and Lucy told herself firmly that it was therefore a very finite and manageable situation. She would be polite at meals. She would be pleasant and appropriate in the parlor. She would do her work, and in 10 days he would ride back to his ranch 40 miles south, and that would be the end of a perfectly unremarkable acquaintance. This plan began to go wrong on the third day, when she came into the dining room for breakfast and found that the only available chair was the one next to Timothy Mercer, because Reverend Whittle had moved to his usual corner, and the Dalton sisters had taken the two end seats in anticipation of a conversation they were clearly having before Lucy arrived. She sat down next to him without remark and reached for the coffee pot, and he passed her the cream before she had to ask for it, which was either remarkable observation or remarkable luck, and she was not sure which was more inconvenient. "You were up early," he said. "Not a question." "I have a dress to finish by Friday," she said. "Mrs. Barlow's daughter is getting married." "Is it a big wedding?" Something shifted in her expression, some small tightening that she could not entirely suppress. "Fairly large, I understand. Mrs. Barlow has rather strong opinions about large weddings." He looked at her sideways over his coffee cup. "You say that as if large weddings were a form of punishment." "I say it as if they were a great deal of unnecessary fuss that tends to lose sight of the actual point," she said, and then heard herself saying it and felt faintly embarrassed by the directness, because it was more candid than she had intended to be. But he only nodded, thoughtfully, as though genuinely considering the position. "I think I know what you mean," he said. "My sister had a big wedding in Denver 2 years ago. 3 days of events, and by the end of it she barely had time to actually talk to the man she was marrying." "Is she happy now?" Lucy asked before she could stop herself. He smiled, and it was the first full smile she had seen from him, warm and a little crooked from the residual swelling on his lip. "Very," he said. "They have a boy named Samuel who just turned 1, and she writes me letters every month that are approximately 40% about the baby and 60% about how much she loves Colorado." She looked back down at her breakfast. "That is a good outcome," she said, and meant it. "It is," he agreed. "I think the wedding was mostly for their mothers, but the marriage was for them." She glanced at him then, a quick, evaluating look, and he met it steadily and without pretension. He was not performing anything, she realized. He was just talking to her. That was its own particular difficulty. On the 5th day he came to find her in the sewing room. She was working on the last of Mrs. Barlow's daughter's wedding dress, a cream silk that was exceptionally unforgiving of any imprecision, and she was concentrating with her whole attention when a knock came at the open door. She looked up, and there he was, hat in hand, looking slightly uncertain in a way that was somehow different from his usual composure. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said. "Mrs. Hatch said you might do alterations." "I do," she said, sitting back and folding her hands in her lap. "What do you need?" He held up the hat. It was a good hat, dark brown with a flat brim, but the band had split and was hanging loose on one side. "The stitching gave out yesterday. I've tried to fix it myself, but I'm useless with a needle." She looked at the hat and then looked at him, and then made a decision she would later identify as the exact moment everything started going sideways, which was to say, "Sit down, Mr. Mercer. It will take me 5 minutes." He sat in the chair across from her work table, which was the only other chair in the small room, and she took the hat and examined the split band. It was a clean break and an easy fix, and she had the needle threaded and the repair begun in less than 2 minutes. The room was quiet except for the sound of her stitching and the distant noise of the street outside. "You're very quick," he observed. "Practice," she said. "How long have you been doing this?" "My mother taught me when I was 7. She was a dressmaker in Philadelphia. I grew up with the shop." "Philadelphia's a long way from Caldwell," he said. "I moved to St. Louis when I was 19 with my husband." She said it flatly, matter-of-factly, and kept her eyes on the stitching. He was quiet for a moment, then carefully, "You're a widow." "I am." She bit the thread cleanly. "He died just before our wedding. We were engaged, not yet married." She handed the hat back to him and met his eyes directly, because she refused to be anything other than straightforward about it. He was not a good man, which doesn't make grieving him any less complicated if you were wondering. He took the hat slowly, looking at it and then at her. "I wasn't asking in order to judge," he said quietly. "I know," she said, which surprised her because she did know. That was the problem. "That will be 10 cents, she added, to put them back on professional ground. He paid her, and as he stood to leave he paused in the doorway. "Miss Morgan," he said, "I know you didn't mean to tell me any of that. I want you to know I'm not going to make it into something you didn't mean it to be." She looked at him for a long moment. "You are a very odd cowboy, Mr. Mercer," she said. Something warm moved through his eyes. "I'll take that as a compliment," he said, and put his hat back on and left. She put down her needle and sat very still for several minutes, staring at nothing in particular, aware of an internal landscape that was shifting in ways she had not given it permission to shift. That evening after supper, he was in the parlor with old Reverend Whittle playing checkers when she came in to borrow a lamp for the sewing room. He looked up from the board and said, "Miss Morgan, we have an impasse here that Reverend Whittle insists involves a theological principle. Would you care to adjudicate?" "It is not theological," said Reverend Whittle with great dignity. "It is merely a question of whether a king can jump backward." "It can," said Lucy. "I told you," said Timothy. "You did not tell me," said the Reverend. "You suggested it with excessive confidence." "The effect is the same," said Timothy, and he and Lucy looked at each other briefly, sharing the comedy of it in a way that was entirely involuntary and entirely mutual, and that look lasted perhaps 1 second longer than it needed to before she took her lamp and went back to work. She finished Mrs. Barlow's daughter's wedding dress on Friday as promised, and she delivered it personally because Mrs. Barlow lived on the edge of town and liked to have her packages delivered with a proper visit, which meant tea and discussion, and the examination of the dress in the strongest available light, and all of this took 2 hours. By the time Lucy walked back through town, the afternoon was full and golden, and the main street of Caldwell was in its usual Friday afternoon state, which meant considerably more horses tied to the posts, considerably more noise from the direction of the saloons, and the general sense of a town loosening its collar after a week of work. She was passing the land office when the door opened and Timothy Mercer came out, carrying a rolled document and looking satisfied. He nearly walked into her and caught himself a step short, and they both said "I'm sorry" at the same moment, and then both stopped, and then he laughed, a real, unguarded laugh that broke the careful composure she had been observing in him all week, and it sounded like something she wanted to hear again. "Good timing," he said. "I'm done at the land office. Can I buy you a cup of coffee, Miss Morgan? The hotel has a decent dining room." She should have said no. She was aware of that. She was aware of it with the clear-eyed certainty of someone who had very recently and very deliberately constructed certain walls for very good reasons. She was also aware that she was standing in the golden afternoon light of a Kansas Friday with a man who had not lied to her once in 5 days, which was a shorter period than it sounded. "All right," she said. "1 cup." They walked to the hotel dining room, which at 4 in the afternoon was quiet and pleasant, with white tablecloths and a woman at the piano in the corner playing something gentle and formless. They ordered coffee and the hotel's apple cake, which was rightly famous in Caldwell, and they talked for 2 hours about things that began as small and became gradually larger. He told her about his ranch, which was called the Mercer M, and which he had built from a land grant he had worked toward for 5 years. He had grown up in Texas, the son of a cattleman and a schoolteacher who between them had given him a very particular combination of practical toughness and genuine love of reading, and he spoke about both his parents with an uncomplicated affection that she found affecting. His father had died 3 years ago, and his mother had gone to live with his sister in Denver, and the ranch was his alone now, along with 6 full-time hands and a cook named Domingo who made the best chili in the Kansas territory and was deeply aware of this fact. She told him more than she meant to. Not about Robert, not the details of that, but about her mother and the dressmaking shop, and the way Philadelphia had smelled in the winter, like coal smoke and cold stone and the river, and about the specific quality of light she had loved in St. Louis in October, amber and heavy, coming through the tall windows of the rooms she had rented on Chestnut Street. She told him she had come to Caldwell because she had run out of better options and found, to her surprise, that it had turned out to be exactly what she needed. "That's the thing about the territory," he said, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table. "It has a way of being what people need without consulting them about it first. That is either wisdom or a very particular form of arrogance," she said. "Could be both," he said, and that crooked smile appeared again, the one she was starting to notice with an alarming regularity. When they finally stood to leave, the piano player had stopped and the dining room was beginning to fill for supper, and Lucy realized with something between embarrassment and wonder that 2 hours had gone by in what felt like 20 minutes. He walked her back to the boarding house in the cooling evening, and at the bottom of the porch steps he stopped and looked at her with those straight, honest brown eyes and said, "Miss Morgan, I have a problem." She raised her eyebrows. "I was only supposed to be in Caldwell for 10 days, he said. "I have been here for 6, and I am starting to feel a strong inclination to discover whether the business I have left could possibly take another week." She looked at him for a long, steady moment. The first stars were coming out over the Kansas sky, and the mockingbird from the back porch had moved around to the front yard and was at it again, tireless and inventive. "That is your problem, Mr. Mercer," she said. "Not mine." And she went inside. She told herself lying in bed that night that she had handled it very well. She had been clear. She had drawn the line. She had not smiled at him on the porch steps, which was an exercise of will she thought deserved some kind of recognition. She had also, as soon as she reached her room, stood at the window and watched him walk away down the street until he was out of sight, which somewhat undermined the accomplishment. He stayed the second week. He said it was because there were additional details to settle with the land office, and this was probably true, but it was not the whole truth, and both of them knew it. He hired 2 experienced trail hands over those days, men he had been recommended by the foreman at the Caldwell stockyards, and he spent his mornings attending to these legitimate reasons for his continued presence in town, but his afternoons increasingly found him in the vicinity of wherever Lucy happened to be. Not in a pressing way, not in the way Robert Kane had done it, which had always felt like occupation. Timothy Mercer's presence was more like the way good weather arrives, noticeable and welcome without demanding acknowledgement. He would appear on the back porch in the evening. He would happen to be walking the same direction on the main street. He borrowed a book from Reverend Whittle's small library and spent an afternoon reading on the parlor sofa, which Lucy pretended to ignore and from which he occasionally read her a sentence or two that he found interesting, and she invariably had something to say about it. On the 9th day of the second week, they walked along the river. It was her suggestion, technically. She had said she wanted to sketch the landscape by the Red River because she was thinking about a pattern for a quilted shawl, and she needed to study the colors of the wildflowers that grew along the bank. This was entirely true. She had brought her small sketchbook, and she did spend a meaningful portion of the walk studying the flowers. It was just that she had also been aware, when she said it, that he was likely to ask if she wanted company, and she had said it in a tone that made the offer easy. The Red River in late May was running clear and quick, its banks thick with cottonwoods and the blue sage and the wild clover that turned the whole lower ground of Kansas into a kind of continuous, unruly garden. They walked along the bank without hurrying, and she sketched, and he pointed out things she might want to include, the way the light hit the water at the bend, the particular shade of purple in a stand of prairie verbena, with the quiet attentiveness of someone who genuinely loved the land he worked on. "You know wildflowers," she said, sketching quickly. "You grow up on the Texas grasslands, you learn them. My mother pressed them, made a kind of herbarium." Took her 20 years to collect every species she found on our land. He was looking at the river with an expression that was fond and a little distant. She took it with her to Denver. It fills 2 whole boxes. That's beautiful, Lucy said, and meant it entirely. He was quiet for a moment, and then he turned and looked at her in that direct, undeflected way he had and said, Lucy. It was the first time he had used her name without the miss in front of it. She kept her eyes on her sketchbook, but her pencil stopped moving. I know what you're protecting yourself from, he said carefully, and I know you have every right to protect it. I'm not going to pretend I'm not hoping you'll let me pass that wall eventually, because I think you know that I am. But I want you to know that I'm not in any hurry. You have had someone make you promises and break them, and that matters. I would rather earn your trust slowly and have it be real than rush it and have it be nothing. She looked up at him then. The cottonwood trees were moving overhead, their leaves catching the light, and the river made its constant sound beside them, and she thought, with a sudden clarity that was almost frightening, that she trusted this man. She did not know when exactly it had happened. Somewhere between the hat band and the apple cake, perhaps. Somewhere between his sister's happy marriage and his mother's herbarium. You are planning to go back to the ranch, she said, at the end of this week. Yes, he said, I have to. The drive starts in 3 weeks and there's work to do. He paused. I would like to come back to Caldwell, if there is reason to come back. She looked at him for a long time. The pencil was still in her hand, and the sketchbook, and the afternoon light was turning that particular gold that it turned in the late spring before it went to amber, and she said, there might be reason. His expression when she said it was something she thought she would probably carry with her for a very long time. Not triumph, because there was none of that in it, just a quiet, genuine gladness that was more moving than triumph would have been. He went back to the ranch at the end of the week, and he did come back to Caldwell. He came back at the end of the cattle drive in late July, leaner and browned by the sun, riding up the main street with the easy certainty of a man who knows where he is going. She was sitting on the front porch of the boarding house when he arrived, because it was a cool evening and she had brought her mending outside, and she looked up from her work and saw him coming and felt something warm and irresistible open in her chest like a window. He dismounted, tied the roan, came up the porch steps and sat in the empty chair beside her as if he had never left. Miss Morgan, he said. Mr. Mercer, she said. You look like you have been outdoors for 2 months. I have been outdoors for 2 months, he said. How was the drive? Successful, he said, and long. He looked at her with a warmth that was completely unguarded now, open and steady as the Kansas sky. I thought about you every day. She kept her eyes on her mending for a moment. Then she folded it in her lap and looked at him directly. I thought about you as well, she said, more than was convenient. He leaned forward in the chair, forearms on his knees, and said, good. And that was, in its own way, the beginning. What followed was courtship in the mode that the territory allowed, which was practical and honest and sometimes awkward and occasionally very beautiful. He came to Caldwell as often as he could manage it from the ranch, which in the summer and early fall was perhaps once every 2 or 3 weeks, and each visit built on the previous one with the methodical, joyful accumulation of 2 people getting to know each other properly. He met her in the hotel dining room for supper. He walked with her on Saturday afternoons. He read to her sometimes from the newspapers he brought up from Wichita, and she had opinions about everything she heard, strong and specific opinions that she had previously kept mostly to herself, and now found she could not contain in his company because he listened to them as though they were interesting, which in her experience was not a thing that could be taken for granted. She told him about Robert properly, one October evening on the back porch with the great Kansas autumn sky going dark above them. She told him about the gambling and the debt and the peculiar combination of grief and relief she had felt at the graveside, and the guilt that the relief had brought with it, which she had carried for 2 years and which she had never told anyone because she had not trusted anyone enough. He listened without interrupting and without the uncomfortable shifting of a person waiting for the discomfort to end, and when she was finished he said, quietly, You did not fail him, Lucy. People fail themselves. You just happened to be nearby. She looked at him in the dark and felt something she had been carrying put itself down. Thank you, she said. He reached over and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat like that in the cool October air until the stars were fully out, not saying much, not needing to. By November they were, by general consensus of everyone in Caldwell who had eyes, in love with each other, which was an assessment that Lucy still could not quite bring herself to confirm out loud, but which she could no longer even privately deny. He was in her thoughts constantly. She had started to feel the weeks between his visits as a kind of absence, a gap that nothing quite filled in the same way, and when he was there everything was somehow more legible, as if the world had better resolution in his company. He was good. That was the thing she kept returning to, the thing that had taken her longest to trust, because she had known charming men and persuasive men and men who spoke beautifully about their own goodness while practicing it selectively. Timothy Mercer was simply, quietly, consistently good. He was fair with the men who worked for him. He was kind to Mrs. Hatch, who was managing a difficult winter cold that November, carrying wood for her without being asked, and paying his board on time, and bringing her a jar of honey from his ranch-cook Domingo's kitchen, that she said was the best she had ever tasted. He was gentle with Reverend Whittle's rambling conversation. He was honest to a degree that occasionally bordered on bluntness but was never unkind. She loved him. She was aware of it in November, sitting in the sewing room one quiet afternoon when he was at the ranch and the wind was making the boarding house creak, and the awareness arrived not with drama but with the simple, solid recognition of something true. She loved him, and she was afraid of it. Not because she did not trust him specifically, because she did, but because love itself was a kind of vulnerability she had learned to regard with deep wariness. And the act of loving fully was the act of handing someone a specific and irreplaceable piece of yourself, and she had done that once and come back from the experience diminished. He came back to Caldwell in the second week of November, and on the second evening of his visit, he asked her to walk with him to the edge of town, where the open grassland began, and the last cottonwoods stood in their late autumn bareness, their branches making clean lines against a deep blue sky. They stood at the edge of the grass, and he faced her with his hat in his hands and the steady seriousness of a man who has thought very carefully about what he is going to say. "I know this may be sooner than you were expecting," he said, "and I know you have reasons to be cautious, and I respect every one of them. But I have been going back and forth on this long enough that Domingo told me last week that I was making the horses nervous with my pacing, so I am going to say what I want to say." She was looking at him very carefully, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. "I love you, Lucy," he said. "I love the way you argue about things you care about, and the way you're gentle with things that are fragile, and the way you see the precise truth of a situation, even when it's uncomfortable, and the way you laughed at Reverend Whittle and the king that can jump backward. I want to marry you if you'll have me. I want to build something with you at the ranch, and I want to watch you argue with Domingo about seasoning, which I guarantee he won't tolerate from anyone else but which I think he'll eventually respect in you, and I want to grow old with you in that territory and be grateful for it every day." She was very still. The wind moved through the cottonwood branches above them with a dry, papery sound. The grassland stretched away to the south, enormous and beautiful and free. She said, "I don't want a big wedding." He blinked. It was not quite what he had been expecting, she could see that, and the expression on his face moved from solemnity to confusion to something that was, unmistakably, the beginning of a smile. "I don't want any of the fuss and the events and the mothers in charge and the dresses that take 6 months, she said, and her voice was not quite steady, but it was sure. "I don't want 3 days of ceremonies and 200 people who barely know us telling us what our marriage means. I just want to actually be married, Timothy, to you, quietly and honestly and without a great production of it." He was smiling now, fully and completely, and there was so much warmth in it that she felt it like sunlight. "Just say yes," he said, "and I will handle everything." She looked at him for a long, suspended moment. This man who had ridden into her very carefully constructed life 6 months ago with mud on his boots and a split lip and entirely honest eyes, and who had not once asked her to be smaller or quieter or less than she was, and who was standing here in the cold November wind holding his hat and looking at her with more love than she had ever been offered by anyone who actually meant it. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Timothy." He crossed the space between them and took her face in both his hands with an extraordinary tenderness, and kissed her in the shadow of the bare cottonwood trees with the great Kansas sky over both of them, and she kissed him back, and it was nothing like she had feared, and everything she had stopped allowing herself to hope for. He was, in the matter of handling everything, as good as his word. He rode back to the ranch the next morning and came back to Caldwell 4 days later with a plan. He had spoken with Judge Edward Harlan, who sat the circuit court in Caldwell, and who was also, as it happened, an old friend of Timothy's father, and a man who held the legal authority to perform marriages in the territory. He had spoken with Reverend Whittle, who was deeply pleased to be involved in an ancillary capacity and had agreed to offer a blessing. He had written to his sister Clara in Denver, not to invite her to come in 2 weeks because the distance was too great, but to tell her the news and to make sure she would have the letter before Christmas. He had spoken with Mrs. Hatch, who had promptly burst into happy tears and offered the boarding-house parlor for the occasion. "How many people?" Lucy asked, looking at him across the boarding-house dining-room table where he was laying out his plan with the efficient organization of a man who runs a cattle operation and is therefore accustomed to coordinating complex things. "8," he said. Judge Harlan, Reverend Whittle, Mrs. Hatch, the Dalton sisters because Mrs. Hatch says it would break their hearts to be excluded, Kincaid if he's still in town, Domingo because he's making the food. And if you make Domingo make food for a celebration and then don't let him attend, there are consequences. And my foreman Jack Platt, who has been with me for 4 years and is the closest thing I have to a brother. 8 people, she said. 8 people, he confirmed. In Mrs. Hatch's parlor, in the afternoon so the light is good. Domingo is making his best dishes and I have ordered a cake from the bakery on 5th Street that is allegedly the finest cake between Wichita and Dodge City. He paused. I also bought you something. He reached into his coat pocket and set a small box on the table between them. It was a plain wooden box, nothing elaborate, and she opened it to find a ring, a simple gold band set with a single small turquoise stone in the deep blue-green of a clear river. It was not ostentatious. It was exactly what she would have chosen herself. She looked up at him. The turquoise is from New Mexico, he said. A silversmith in Wichita had it. It reminded me of the river the first afternoon we walked by it. She picked it up carefully and looked at the stone, which had a depth to it, a kind of quality of captured light. It's perfect, she said, quietly and completely. He smiled. I'm glad. She put it on her right hand for now, because they had agreed the ceremony would be in 2 weeks, on the first Saturday of December, and she wanted to keep the formality of the occasion. The 2 weeks between were their own particular happiness. The knowledge of what was coming felt like warmth, like the banking of a fire that is going to last through the night. She wrote to her cousin Margaret in Philadelphia, who had been her closest friend in childhood and who wrote back by telegraph, which cost more than Margaret usually spent on anything, with a message that said, "About time. So glad, be happy. Love M." She made her own dress. Of course she did. It was not white, because she thought that was a convention that did not particularly apply to her circumstances, and also because she was a seamstress who understood fabric, and she had found at the Caldwell dry goods store a length of deep blue wool crepe that was the precise color she wanted, the color of the Kansas sky at the good hour between 4 and 5 in the afternoon when the light was horizontal and the world went blue and gold. She made it fitted and simple, with a small standing collar and pearl buttons down the front bodice, and she spent 3 evenings on the hem in the sewing room, stitching it with the same meticulous care she gave everything, and feeling, for the first time in years, that she was doing something entirely for herself and not in spite of anything. Timothy spent the week before the wedding at the ranch and rode back to Caldwell on the Friday, arriving in the late afternoon with Jack Platt, his foreman, and Domingo, who came with an entire wagon bed of supplies, and who was, as promised, a compact man of Mexican descent with silver at his temples, and an expression of concentrated artistic authority that Lucy immediately recognized as belonging to someone who was genuinely exceptional at what they did. Domingo stepped down from the wagon, assessed Lucy with a direct and not unfriendly look, and said, in the manner of someone making a professional declaration, "Miss Morgan, Timothy says you are difficult about food." Lucy looked at Timothy. "I did not say difficult," Timothy said in a tone of mild defensiveness. "I said particular." "It is the same thing," Domingo said without heat. "Good, I respect it." He looked back at Lucy. "Tell me what you like and I will make it better." She decided immediately that she liked Domingo very much. Jack Platt was a weathered, quiet man of about 40 with a face that had spent 20 years in the Texas sun and a handshake that was brief and firm. He said, "Miss Morgan, I'm glad to meet you," with a sincerity that was uncomplicated, and she had the sense that he was exactly the kind of man you wanted alongside you when things were difficult, which meant he was exactly the right man to have at your side in this territory, and at this rancher's right hand. The night before the wedding, she sat alone on the back porch of the boarding house in the cold December air, wrapped in a heavy shawl, looking at the stars. It was clear and cold, and the stars over Kansas in December were extraordinary, thick and brilliant, and so close they felt almost addressable. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and the cold air moving through the cottonwood trees, and she was not afraid. That was the thing she noticed, sitting there with the great silence of the prairie around her. She was not afraid. She was aware of the weight of what she was doing, the complete and voluntary surrender of the wall she had spent 2 years building, and she was not afraid of it. She was ready. She heard the door open behind her, and Timothy came out in his coat and hat and sat in the other chair. "Couldn't sleep," he said. "Neither could I," she said. They sat together in the cold and the silence and the stars. "Lucy," he said after a while, "I want you to know something. I'm not going to be perfect. I'm going to make mistakes, and I'm going to sometimes be too stubborn, and I'll probably argue about things I should just let go. But I am going to try, every single day, to be the kind of man you deserve, and I'm going to tell you the truth always, even when it's inconvenient, and I am going to love you for the rest of my life whether you like it or not." She laughed, which was not the response he had perhaps strictly anticipated, but it was the truest one, and it came from somewhere deep and genuine, and he laughed with her, and in the cold December night with the stars overhead and the prairie breathing around them, something settled into its right place between them quietly and completely. "I know," she said when the laughter had softened, "and I'm going to love you back, whether you like it or not." He reached over and took her hand, and she gave it freely this time, without calculation, without the small backward instinct of protection. They sat like that until the cold finally drove them inside, and she went to her room and slept better than she had slept in years. The morning of the first Saturday of December, 1878, was bright and sharp, and cold in the way the Kansas Territory did cold in the winter, a cleanness to the air that was almost aggressive, the sky a hard, flawless blue and the ground frozen into a sparkle. Mrs. Hatch had decorated the parlor the evening before, while Lucy was upstairs, and at Lucy's specific request, nothing elaborate green boughs from the cottonwoods, a few dried wildflowers from the arrangement Mrs. Hatch kept on the mantel all year, and candles, tall white candles in brass holders that she had brought out from a trunk in the back room. The result was simple and genuinely lovely. Domingo had arrived at the boarding house at 6 in the morning, and had taken over Mrs. Hatch's kitchen, with a focused intensity that had caused Mrs. Hatch, who was normally entirely in command of her own kitchen, to retreat to the parlor with the expression of someone choosing their battles wisely. The smells coming from the kitchen by 9 o'clock in the morning were remarkable. Slow-roasted beef and corn bread and something sweet and spiced that turned out to be a kind of Mexican wedding cookie that Domingo had added to the menu independently, and which nobody was going to argue about. Lucy dressed in her room with the help of Martha Dalton, who had appointed herself Lucy's personal attendant for the morning with a warm, sisterly efficiency that Lucy found genuinely touching. Martha did Lucy's hair, pinning it up in the soft, loose style that Lucy preferred, and pronounced the blue dress exactly right, and handed her a small bouquet that Grace Dalton had made from dried lavender and late-blooming prairie sage that she had pressed months ago, which was the kind of thing that Grace Dalton was quietly very good at. Lucy stood in front of the mirror in her room and looked at herself in the blue dress, the single strand of pearls that had been her mother's. The turquoise ring moved to her left hand for the day, and she felt, cleanly and wholly, like herself. Not like a performance of happiness. Not like the version of herself that was making the best of something. Like herself, on the best day she had been allowed in a very long time. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, she walked down the stairs of the boarding house into the parlor. Judge Harlan was there, silver-haired and dignified in his best suit, holding his official papers with the gravity appropriate to the occasion. Reverend Whittle stood to one side, pink-cheeked and pleased, clutching his Bible. Mrs. Hatch was already wiping her eyes in the back row, between the Dalton sisters and Horace Kincaid, who had extended his Caldwell stay specifically, because he said he would not miss it for a survey of the whole territory. Domingo stood near the kitchen door, arms folded, with the expression of a man who was moved but was not going to acknowledge it publicly. Jack Platt stood near the window, hands clasped in front of him, solid and present and quietly glad. And Timothy Mercer stood at the end of the small room facing the door, in a dark suit that was clearly new and had been pressed within an inch of its life, with his hair combed and his hat absent and those brown eyes of his steady and warm and fixed entirely on her. She walked toward him, and he did not move, just watched her come with an expression of such uncomplicated love and gratitude that she felt it like warmth all the way to her center. She took his hands, both of them, and they faced each other, and Judge Harlan opened his papers and it began. It was not a long ceremony. That was exactly right. The words were simple and true, and the room was small and warm with candlelight and Domingo's cooking. And when Judge Harlan said the words that mattered and Timothy said, "I do," with a steadiness and a conviction that she heard in her bones, she said, "I do" back with the same, and she meant it with everything she was. He slid the plain gold band onto her finger beside the turquoise ring, because they had had a second ring made in Wichita to go with it, simple gold to match, and she slid a plain gold band onto his hand. And Judge Harlan said, "I now pronounce you man and wife." And Timothy Mercer, with a gentleness that was also full of joy, kissed her in front of 8 people in Mrs. Hatch's parlor, and Mrs. Hatch burst fully into tears, and Reverend Whittle said, "Amen." And Domingo turned around and went back to the kitchen to plate the food. The party that followed was exactly what it should have been. Small and warm and full of real conversation and Domingo's extraordinary food, and the cake from the bakery on 5th Street, which was in fact as good as advertised. 3 layers of white cake with honey buttercream and crushed pecans on the sides, and glasses of good wine that Jack Platt had contributed from a bottle he had been saving for 3 years for what he called the right occasion. They toasted to the new couple. Judge Harlan gave a short and elegant speech. Reverend Whittle gave a slightly longer and more wandering one that was nonetheless entirely sincere. Martha Dalton cried quietly, and Grace Dalton held her hand. Kincaid proposed a second toast to what he called the most sensible marriage in Caldwell County, which caused general laughter, and Jack Platt said nothing in the way of a speech because that was not his nature, but caught Timothy's eye across the room and gave a single, significant nod that contained a great deal. Lucy sat at the table beside her husband, and the word husband did not feel strange at all, which itself was strange and wonderful, and she ate Domingo's food and drank a little wine and talked to the people around her with a lightness and a happiness that was entirely genuine. She looked at Timothy across the table when he was talking to Jack Platt, not knowing she was watching, and she thought about the afternoon she had first seen him riding up the main street on his roan horse, and the curtain she had dropped so quickly, and she thought, "You do not know what is coming for you, and thank God for that." He caught her watching him, and the corner of his mouth lifted in that crooked, warm smile, and she did not look away this time. She held his gaze and smiled back, fully and freely, and he lifted his glass slightly in her direction across the table, a small, private toast, and she lifted hers in return. When the party had run its natural course and the guests had said their affectionate goodbyes, and Mrs. Hatch had been persuaded to let Domingo's kitchen helpers do the washing up, and the candles had burned low, Timothy and Lucy stood together on the back porch in the cold December night, their coats on, his arm around her shoulders, her head tilted slightly toward him. "We did that," she said. "We did," he agreed. "It was exactly right," she said. "You were exactly right," he said, and kissed her temple, and she leaned into his warmth with the ease of someone who has found the right place to be. They left Caldwell 2 days later, Timothy and Lucy Mercer, in the ranch wagon loaded with her belongings and his supplies, with the roan tied behind, and the Kansas sky immense above them, riding south toward the Triple M with Jack Platt riding alongside and Domingo in front driving with the authority of a man who has driven wagons across more territory than most and sees no reason to rush. Lucy sat next to her husband on the wagon bench with her hands folded in her lap and the cold air fresh on her face, and the prairie opening around them in every direction, vast and honest and unobstructed, and she felt something she had not felt in years settle around her like a garment that finally fit. The ranch was 40 miles south of Caldwell, which in December meant a journey of 2 solid days with a night camped beside the wagon, which was cold but not unbearable because Domingo built the fire with an architect's precision, and the camp cooking was, if anything, better than the boarding house version. Lucy discovered that she did not mind sleeping under the stars in the Kansas winter, which was something she would not have predicted about herself 6 months ago, and which she found genuinely delightful to discover. The Triple M appeared on the afternoon of the second day, a grouping of buildings at the base of a long, slow rise in the grassland, a solid 2-story house with a wide porch, a large barn, a bunkhouse, 2 smaller outbuildings, and a windmill turning slowly in the afternoon wind. The grass around it was winter brown, but the structure of the land was beautiful, open to the sky in all directions, with a creek running along the eastern boundary lined with cottonwood trees that even in December had a grace to them. It was, she could see immediately, a place that had been built with real intention. Someone had cared about it. "It's yours now, too," Timothy said beside her. She looked at it and then at him and said, "It's ours." He smiled so broadly that she laughed, and Domingo said from the front of the wagon, without turning his head, "Welcome home, Mrs. Mercer," with a kind of deliberate dignity that made the words feel like a genuine ceremony. The 6 ranch hands came out to meet the wagon with a mixture of curiosity and respect that was typical of men who had worked a long time for someone they trusted. Timothy introduced her to each of them, and she shook their hands and remembered their names, all 6 of them, which she could see surprised them, and this first impression served her well for a long time afterward. The house itself was more comfortable inside than she had quite expected. Timothy had grown up with a schoolteacher mother, and it showed in the presence of bookshelves and in the general quality of the furnishings, which were not elaborate but were good and carefully chosen. There was a parlor with a large stone fireplace and windows that looked south over the grassland, and a dining room, and a kitchen that Domingo already treated as primarily his, and upstairs 3 bedrooms, the main one with windows that faced east over the creek and the cottonwoods. She stood at those east windows the first evening, watching the light go out of the sky over the cottonwood trees, and Timothy came and stood beside her, and the room behind them was lit by the lamp on the bedside table, warm and quiet. "I was going to tell you something earlier," he said, and then Domingo drove over a rut and the moment was lost. "Tell me now," she said. "I have been thinking about the sewing room," he said. "There is a room at the end of the upstairs hall that gets the best light in the house. Northeastern light, the kind that doesn't shift much through the day. I was thinking, if you wanted it, we could set it up for you. A proper workroom. There's enough room for your work table and a cutting surface and all of it." She turned and looked at him. "You've been thinking about that." "For a while," he said, without apology or false modesty. "You gave up your business to come here, and I know your work matters to you. I don't want you to give that up." She looked at him steadily in the warm lamplight of their bedroom in the house that was theirs, and she said, "Timothy, I love you enormously." He smiled, the full, warm, crooked one. "I know," he said. "It's reciprocated." She set up the sewing room at the end of the hall the following week, and it became, over the months and years ahead, one of the rooms she loved best in the house, with its steady northeastern light and the view of the grassland from its window and the smell of wool and clean cotton, that she found as calming as anything in the world. The first winter at the Triple M was full and educational. She learned the rhythms of a cattle ranch, which were quite different from the rhythms of a boarding house or a city seamstress shop, and she applied herself to understanding them with the same focused attention she gave to a new pattern or a difficult seam. She learned the names and habits of the cattle, which were more individual in their personalities than she had expected. She learned that Domingo's kitchen was a collaborative space once he had decided to admit you, which he communicated not by explicit invitation, but by one day simply appearing beside her while she was attempting to bake bread and saying, "No," and then showing her exactly how it ought to be done, which she accepted as the honor it clearly was. She began to take in sewing work from the surrounding area, because word traveled in cattle country, and within 3 months of her arrival she had customers in 4 directions for a radius of 20 miles. Women who drove out to the ranch or sent their husbands with bundles of fabric and carefully written notes about what they needed. She made dresses and altered trousers and repaired harnesses. And once, memorably, a request came from a family 40 miles east for a christening gown, which she made from a piece of white lawn that had been in the family for 2 generations, and which she returned to them so beautifully completed that the mother cried. Timothy watched all of this with evident pride and no attempt to manage any of it, which was exactly the right response. He ran his ranch and she ran her business, and they ran the house together, and it worked with a naturalness that she had not dared predict, but that she found, every morning when she woke up beside him in the east-facing bedroom, to be the simplest and most reliable fact of her life. In the spring of 1879, a letter came from Clara in Denver, Timothy's sister, with a photograph enclosed, a formal studio portrait of Clara and her husband and their son Samuel, who was now 2 years old and appeared in the photograph to be an extremely determined small person who was clearly unhappy about being required to hold still. Lucy read the letter aloud to Timothy at breakfast, because Clara's letters were long and entertaining, filled with details about Denver and Samuel's various opinions about the world and her husband Thomas's work with a new railway company, and the 40% about the baby, 60% about Colorado proportion that he had described all those months ago. At the bottom of the letter, Clara had written, "Timothy, I have never seen you look the way you look in the daguerreotype you sent me from November. I think Miss Morgan has done something very good for you. Tell her from me that I am grateful, and that I expect to love her when we finally meet, which I hope will be soon." Lucy looked up from the letter to find Timothy watching her with an expression of quiet tenderness. "She's going to be right," he said, "about loving you." "Tell her I feel the same way," Lucy said, "in advance." Clara and Thomas came to the ranch that following autumn, a journey of several days from Denver, with 2-year-old Samuel, who proved to be exactly as determined and energetic in person as his photograph suggested. He took an immediate shine to Lucy, which she was genuinely delighted by and which Timothy found completely unsurprising, and he spent the whole week of their visit following her around the sewing room, asking questions about the fabric and the needles with the relentless curiosity of a small person who has recently discovered that everything is interesting. Clara was warm and quick and funny, and she and Lucy recognized each other in the way that certain women do, as people who see clearly and speak honestly and prefer the actual thing to the performance of it. They talked for long hours over 3 days, and by the end of it, Clara had told Lucy things about Timothy's childhood that Lucy carefully stored for future reference and possible deployment. "He used to practice his roping on the fence posts," Clara said, over coffee on the porch one afternoon, "and the fence posts won more often than he did in the early days, and he would never, ever admit it." "I remember this differently," Timothy said, from the other end of the porch, where he was smoking a pipe and pretending not to be listening. "You remember it incorrectly," said Clara. "I have no fence posts to contradict the account," Lucy said, "so I will simply believe both of you." Timothy looked at her with an expression that said this was not actually the neutral position she was presenting it as, and she looked back at him with an expression of perfect innocence, and Clara watched this exchange with undisguised delight. When Clara and Thomas and Samuel left at the end of the week, heading back north toward Denver, Lucy stood beside Timothy watching the wagon diminish on the long road that went north from the Triple M, and she felt the warm, satisfying completeness of a family she had not known she was gaining when she had said yes to a cowboy in the shadow of the cottonwood trees. "She loves you already," Timothy said beside her. "She told me last night." "I love her already too," Lucy said. "I told her this morning." He laughed and put his arm around her, and they stood watching the road long after the wagon had disappeared over the rise, because neither of them was in any particular hurry to go inside. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was hard in Kansas, harder than the previous year. The cold arrived earlier and was more sustained, and a stretch in February of punishing blizzard weather kept the ranch confined for 3 weeks in a way that tested everyone's patience and resourcefulness. 3 of the cattle herd were lost in the worst storm, which was a real economic loss that Timothy took seriously and quietly and did not catastrophize. The hands worked through the worst of it with the grim, competent endurance of men who had done this before, and Domingo's kitchen became the center of the ranch's warmth and sustenance in a very literal sense, the stove going all day, and the kitchen always smelling of something hot and fortifying. Lucy made good use of the long indoor days. She had taken on a commission in November that she had been waiting for the right stretch of time to complete, a full quilt for a ranch family 40 miles east, an ambitious project involving 30 different fabrics in a pattern she had designed herself, inspired by the colors of the Kansas grassland through the seasons, the winter brown and the spring green and the summer gold and the autumn amber. She worked on it through the blizzard weeks, and Timothy would come in the evenings to the sewing room and sit with a book and the lamp between them, and the howling of the wind outside was somehow made smaller by the quality of the warmth within. It was on one of these February evenings, the storm reduced to a low moan outside and the lamp burning steadily and the quilt spread across her knees in its accumulated colors, that she looked up from her work and said, "Timothy, I think we may be expecting a baby." He looked up from his book very slowly. The room was quiet except for the wind and the sound of the lamp. He set the book down carefully, and she watched him process the information with the deliberate thoroughness of someone who wants to be certain they have understood correctly, and then his face broke into an expression of such pure, unguarded joy that she felt it physically, like a wave of warmth. He crossed the room in 3 strides and knelt beside her chair and took both her hands in his and said, "Are you certain?" "Not completely," she said, "but fairly sure, perhaps 6 weeks along." He looked at her for a long moment with those brown eyes that had always told the truth, and then he said, "Lucy, how do you feel?" She considered this properly because it was a real question and deserved a real answer. "Surprised," she said, "and a little frightened, and very glad." He raised her hands and pressed his lips to them, and when he looked up again his eyes were bright, and he said, "Good. That is exactly how I feel." He paused. "I am going to be completely useless with worry for approximately 9 months. You are not going to be useless," she said. "You are going to be exactly as competent and steady as you always are, because that is what you are. Promise me you'll tell me if you need anything," he said. "Anything at all." "I promise," she said. "Now go back to your book. I have 48 squares left to finish." He laughed and kissed her forehead and went back to his chair, and she went back to her quilting. And outside, the February wind moved across the Kansas grassland with its ancient indifference, and inside the lamp burned warm and steady. She told Domingo in the morning. She told him because he ran the kitchen and would need to know, and also because she had come to regard him as a member of the family in everything that mattered. He received the news with a gravity that transformed after a moment into a complicated expression of something between pride and deep emotion that he immediately suppressed under a professional manner. "You will need iron," he said, "and warm broth, every morning before anything else." "All right," she said, "and no lifting of anything heavy." "That seems sensible," she agreed. "And I will adjust the menu." He said this with the authority of a man for whom the menu was a matter of genuine moral importance. "We will make sure you and the baby are well." She looked at him and said, "Domingo, thank you." He gave her a single, brief nod and returned to his stove, and she thought that if Domingo was going to adjust the menu in her honor, her child was going to enter the world very well fed indeed. She wrote to Clara the same week, because Clara would be devastated not to hear quickly, and the letter that came back was entirely predictable in its warmth and length and percentage of enthusiasm. Clara wrote about every aspect of her own experience with Samuel, and offered opinions and encouragements, and a recipe for ginger tea that she said had been indispensable, and which Lucy pinned to the wall of the sewing room. She wrote to her cousin Margaret in Philadelphia, who replied with a letter so full of joy and very specific advice that Lucy read it twice and laughed through most of it, and then wrote back a long, detailed response that covered everything they had not said to each other in years, because the news of a baby had a way of opening certain conversational gates. The spring came in March, as it did on the Kansas prairie, with a sudden violent persuasiveness, the grassland going from brown to the most vivid green in the space of what felt like a single warm week, and the wildflowers coming up along the creek banks in their reliable sequence, and the cattle moving through the spring grass with an ease that made the whole hard winter seem worth it. Lucy watched all of it from the windows of the sewing room, or from the porch in the afternoon, and she was large enough by April that Domingo began positioning extra chair cushions wherever she was likely to sit, which she found both touching and slightly excessive, and told him so, and he disagreed without altering his behavior. The baby came on the 15th of May, 1880, in the room with the east-facing windows, assisted by Mrs. Clara Dawes, the ranch midwife, who came over from the neighboring valley and who was brisk and competent, and kind in the exact combination the situation required. The labor was long and honest work, and Timothy was in the room for most of it because she wanted him there and said so, which Mrs. Dawes confirmed was not unusual for a woman with good sense. He held her hand and talked to her during the worst of it with that low, steady voice, and she gripped his hand hard enough to cause lasting impressions, and he did not flinch or complain once. The baby, when he arrived, was a boy. He was red and loud and extremely opinionated about his arrival, which Lucy felt was a good beginning. Timothy held him for the first time with the careful, reverent attention of someone handling the most important thing he has ever been handed, which was accurate, and looked at this small, furious new person with an expression that Lucy would carry for the rest of her life: absolute and complete love, simple and immediate and without condition. "Hello," Timothy said to the baby, very quietly. "I am your father. We are going to be great friends." The baby stopped crying for approximately 4 seconds, looked at him with the unfocused but intense attention of the very newly born, and then resumed. "He just needed to hear your voice," Lucy said, exhausted and wholly content. "He has your opinion of introductions," Timothy said, and Lucy laughed, which surprised Mrs. Dawes, who had not heard many women laugh quite that genuinely in the minutes after delivery. They named him James William Mercer, James for Timothy's father and William for Lucy's grandfather, and the name suited him from the first day in the way that some names suit a person immediately. James was dark-haired like his father and had his mother's directness of gaze, and Domingo took one look at him, said "good," with the air of someone confirming a professional expectation, and went back to the kitchen to make a celebratory meal of a scope that was completely unnecessary and absolutely perfect. Clara and Thomas made the trip from Denver within 6 weeks of receiving the news, because Clara was constitutionally incapable of waiting longer than that for a nephew, and Samuel, now 3 years old, greeted baby James with a lordly condescension that gradually, over the course of the visit, softened into something genuinely tender. By the end of the week, he had appointed himself James's primary guardian against all threats, which was generous given that the threats in question were largely limited to loud noises and unexpected changes of temperature. Lucy sat on the porch in the June warmth with James in her arms and Clara beside her, drinking coffee, watching Timothy and Thomas walk the fence line with Jack Platt in the middle distance, and the ranch spread around them in its summer abundance, the grass green and the cottonwoods full and the windmill turning in the warm afternoon air. "You look happy," Clara said. "I am," Lucy said, without qualification or deflection. "Completely." "Good," said Clara in the simple, warm tone of someone to whom this matters very much. "I was not always," Lucy said after a moment. "I think I forgot what it felt like. And now you remember." "Yes," she said, "every morning." They sat for a while in comfortable silence, and James slept in her arms with the absolute trustfulness of someone who has never had reason not to. And the afternoon light moved slow and golden across the Kansas grassland, and Lucy thought about the woman who had stood at the Red River 2 years ago and thrown a ring into the current and sworn she was finished with promises. And she thought of that woman with great tenderness and a specific kind of gratitude. Because that woman had made all of this possible by choosing to survive, and by getting on a train to Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1878, and by sitting at a boarding house window at exactly the right moment. She thought that perhaps that was what the territory did, what it had been offering all along to the people who came to it. Not safety, because it was not safe, and not ease, because it was not easy, but a kind of openness, an absence of fixed walls, a sky so big that even the most carefully maintained barriers were eventually made to feel small beneath it. And in that openness, if you were paying attention and not too frightened, things you had not expected could simply ride up the main street on a roan horse with mud on their boots and honest eyes and change everything. In the years that followed, the Triple M grew steadily. Timothy expanded the herd and negotiated a good cattle contract with a buyer in Kansas City that gave the ranch a financial security that allowed him to make long-term improvements he had been planning since before the first winter. A new barn was built in the fall of 1881, and the bunkhouse was expanded, and the house itself gained a back addition with a larger kitchen that Domingo accepted as a professional advance, and Lucy accepted as the gift of a better-lit workspace when she moved the cutting table back there. James learned to walk and then to run with the fearless determination of a ranch boy who had grown up surrounded by horses and open grass and men who moved with purpose. And he was quick and curious and very funny in the precise, observant way of a child who watches adults carefully and makes his own assessments. He went everywhere with his father from the age of 2 onward, trailing behind Timothy on the rounds of the ranch with the focused seriousness of someone in training. And Timothy treated him with exactly the right combination of affection and respect for his developing personhood that made James, from his earliest coherent age, deeply confident that he was loved and that his questions mattered. By the spring of 1882, Lucy discovered she was expecting again, which she told Timothy on the porch in the evening in the same quiet, certain way she had told him the first time, and he reacted with the same pure, unguarded joy that she had stored so carefully from the first occasion, and was gratified to find had not diminished at all in the reproduction. Domingo, informed the following morning, adjusted the menu again without ceremony, and with the competence of a man for whom this was now established procedure. James, informed with age-appropriate simplicity that a new baby was coming, thought about this for several days before announcing that he wanted a brother, because brothers were more useful than sisters, and Lucy told him that brothers were quite useful but so were sisters, and James considered this and said, "All right, but a brother would be better," and she thought this was a reasonable and sufficiently diplomatic position for a 2-year-old to take. The second baby arrived in November of 1882, on a clear, cold night that was much faster and less difficult than the first, as Mrs. Dawes confirmed was often the case. It was a girl, small and dark-haired like James and like her father, with her mother's mouth and an expression even in her first minutes that suggested she was going to have opinions. James, presented with his sister the following morning, examined her with a careful, assessing look that lasted about 10 seconds, and then said hello, with a gravity that made everyone in the room want to laugh and somehow didn't quite. They named her Eliza Clara Mercer, Clara for Timothy's sister, which caused Clara, when she received the letter, to write back a response that was almost entirely made up of enthusiastic punctuation and a promise to come as soon as weather permitted. Eliza turned out to be, as her first expression suggested, a person with extensive opinions and no particular hesitation about voicing them, and the dynamic between her and James evolved over the following years, with a complexity and entertainment value that Lucy and Timothy observed with great enjoyment from the sidelines. They were very different people and very good friends, which is perhaps the best combination a sibling relationship can achieve. In the spring of 1883, on the occasion of their 5th wedding anniversary, Timothy came into the sewing room one afternoon where Lucy was working and sat in the chair across from the work table, which was the same arrangement they had had on the day of the hat band, and she looked up at him and saw that he had brought something. It was a box, a small polished wooden box, nicer than the one the turquoise ring had come in. She set down her work and opened it. Inside was a brooch, silver, shaped like a cottonwood branch with tiny leaves of hammered silver, and in the center, where a bird might nest, a small cluster of turquoise stones in the same blue-green as her ring. It was made by the same silversmith in Wichita, she could see from the maker's mark, and it was beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they have been specifically imagined for a specific person. She looked at it for a long time and then looked at him. 5 years, he said. You told me once you didn't want a big wedding. I thought you might accept a very small anniversary. This is perfect, she said, as she had said of the ring, and as with the ring she meant it entirely. He came around the work table and she stood, and he pinned the brooch to her collar with a careful attention that she found deeply endearing because his hands, which were so capable with ropes and tools and horses, moved around the silver pin with the focused delicacy of someone not wanting to make a mistake about something that matters. I want to tell you something, he said, his hands still at her collar, his eyes on the brooch. Tell me, she said. He looked at her then, and all the years of it were in his eyes, The ride into Caldwell and the curtain and the hat band and the apple cake and the Red River and the cottonwood trees and the wedding and James and Eliza, and every morning in the east-facing bedroom, and every evening on the porch, and every winter storm managed together, and every spring arrival celebrated, and every difficult thing carried in common. I would do it all again, he said. From the very first day, I would do every bit of it again. She put her hand to his face, the way she did when she wanted to be sure he knew she was entirely present, and said, "So would I from the curtain forward." He laughed, and she laughed, and the sewing room was full of the good light of a Kansas spring morning. And 2 rooms away James was arguing with Eliza about something involving the farm cat, and Domingo was making something in the kitchen that smelled like corn bread, and the cottonwoods along the creek were coming into their full green abundance, and outside the window the grassland stretched away to every horizon under a sky that was impossibly, perfectly blue. They stood together in the sewing room with the light coming through the window and the brooch bright at her collar, and 5 years of a life they had built from the frank exchange of 2 people who had been honest with each other from the beginning. And she thought that this was the thing she had not believed was possible, not because she had been cynical, but because she had been protecting herself from hope. And what she had found instead was that hope had been waiting very patiently on a roan horse at the top of the main street of Caldwell, Kansas, in the 2nd week of May, 1878, and had simply needed her to stop dropping the curtain long enough to see it clearly. The years continued to unfold with the steady, generous pace of a good life fully inhabited. James grew tall and steady like his father, deeply in love with the land and the cattle and the work of the ranch in a way that was not obligation but vocation. And Timothy began teaching him the whole of the operation in his early teens with the patient thoroughness of someone who loves what he is handing on. Eliza grew sharp and creative and became, to no one's particular surprise, deeply interested in Lucy's sewing, and by the age of 8 had a small work-basket of her own, and could produce a respectable running stitch, and had opinions about color combinations that were frequently unconventional and frequently right. Clara and Thomas came to visit as often as the journey from Denver allowed, and Samuel, growing up into a thoughtful and lanky young man, became James's closest friend among their extended circle, the bond between cousins who are also genuinely similar in temperament, and who chose each other as much as family gave them to each other. Letters flew regularly between the ranch and Denver, and Lucy and Clara maintained a correspondence that deepened every year with the accumulated intimacy of 2 women who had decided to truly know each other. Old Reverend Whittle received his permanent posting in 1881 and moved to a church in Wichita, but wrote regularly with the gentle, meandering affection of an old man who considered the people he had known at Mrs. Hatch's table as a kind of late-life family. Mrs. Hatch herself ran the boarding house until 1885 and then retired to live with her daughter in Topeka, and sent Lucy a jar of the best honey from a Kansas apiary as a parting gift, which arrived wrapped in paper with a note that said, "You were the finest boarder I ever had, and I say this as someone who has had many boarders, because you left things better than you found them." Lucy kept the note. Domingo stayed at the Triple M, of course he did. The Triple M was where the kitchen was, and Domingo and his kitchen were not separable. He became, over the years, one of the most important people in both James's and Eliza's lives, teaching James to cook when the boy expressed interest around age 10, and teaching Eliza that precision in measurement was as important in baking as in sewing, a comparison that Eliza accepted because she trusted Domingo's judgment about things that mattered. He was, to all practical purposes, family, and was treated as such by all 5 of them, and he accepted this with the quiet dignity of a man who has always known his own worth but is not unaffected by being recognized. Jack Platt took a wife in 1884, a widow from the next county named Ruth Aldrich, who was practical and warm, and who Jack had been quietly attentive to for 2 years before he finally said anything, which was very much in keeping with his character. Lucy made Ruth's wedding dress, a simple, well-cut cream wool, at Ruth's specific request, and the wedding was small and honest and held at the Triple M with Domingo's food, because Ruth said she had heard about Domingo's food, and the wedding was a reason to confirm the stories. Lucy stood beside Timothy at the small ceremony and felt the warm, specific happiness of watching two people find the right thing, and Timothy's hand found hers during the vows and held it, which it always did. There was a drought in the summer of 1886 that was the hardest thing the ranch faced in all its years, a relentless, baking summer that dried the creek to a trickle and browned the grass and killed pasture that took 2 years to come back. It required the kind of sustained, creative problem-solving that showed what a person and a marriage were made of, and what Lucy and Timothy were made of turned out to be something quite solid. They worked through it together, making decisions jointly and without drama, allocating resources carefully, keeping the hands employed and the household steady. And when it broke in the fall of 1886 with the first serious rain in 4 months, the whole ranch felt it the way a person feels the release of a long-held breath. Timothy came in from checking the rain gauges that September evening soaked to the skin and grinning like a man who has been given a tremendous and unexpected gift, which he had been. Lucy met him at the door with a towel and the expression of someone who has been waiting at the window, and he came inside and she handed him the towel and he put it over his head and said from underneath it, 3 inches and still going, and she put her arms around him, towel and all, and held on, and he held her back. "We made it through," she said. "We always will," he said. "That's just how it is." She thought in that moment that he was right. Not because bad things would not happen, because they would, and they had, and they would again, but because the thing they had built between them was not the kind of thing that could be dried out by a summer. It had roots that went down below whatever the surface was doing, deep and patient, and anchored in everything they had been honest with each other about from the very beginning. James married in 1898, when he was 18, a girl named Anne from the neighboring valley who had grown up on a cattle ranch of her own, and who knew what a working life looked like and wanted it. Lucy watched her son marry with the full, uncomplicated joy of a mother who has seen her child choose well, and she stood beside Timothy during the small, honest ceremony at the ranch, his arm around her, and felt the continuity of it, the rightness of a small wedding in a place that mattered to the people who lived there. Eliza went east for formal schooling in dressmaking in 1899, her mother having taught her everything she could teach, and recognized that the girl had a talent that deserved proper development. She went to Kansas City with her mother's blessing and her father's worry and Domingo's careful packing of more food than she could possibly need for the journey, and she came back 2 years later with a professional's eye and a portfolio of designs that made Lucy sit very quietly for a long time looking at them and then say, "Eliza, these are extraordinary." Eliza, who had her mother's directness, said, "I know," and then smiled in a way that was entirely her own. There came an evening in the spring of the new century, 1901, when Lucy and Timothy sat on the porch of the Triple M in the long, slow dusk of a Kansas April, in the chairs they had sat in for 23 years. The cottonwoods along the creek were fully leafed and moving in a warm wind. James and Anne were in the barn, and their own baby, now 8 months old and named Thomas for Clara's husband who had died the previous year, was asleep in the house under Domingo's watchful care. Eliza was in the sewing room, working late, as she often did. The grassland was the deep green of early spring, and the sky above it was doing what the Kansas sky always did in the evening, that long, elaborate theater of color that never quite repeated itself and never quite lost its power to stop whatever else you were doing and make you simply look at it. Timothy had his coffee. Lucy had her tea. They had been out here for an hour already, not talking much, not needing to. After 23 years, the silences between them were the most comfortable silences she had ever known, dense with the accumulated familiarity of a shared life, full of the things that didn't need saying, because they had already been said in every way that mattered. She was 47 years old and he was 50, and they were not young anymore in the way they had been on the riverbank with the wildflowers, but she did not feel old in any way that diminished what they were. She felt, on the contrary, that they had simply become more thoroughly themselves, the way a good material becomes more supple and real with age, the character of it deepening rather than fading. She looked at him in the evening light, the gray that had come into his dark hair, and the lines that had accumulated at the corners of those brown eyes, and the set of his shoulders that was as familiar to her as anything in the world. And she felt the same thing she had felt on the porch of Mrs. Hatch's boarding house 23 years ago, when she had watched him walk away down the street and known, in the betrayal of her own carefully constructed defenses, that something had already changed. He turned and found her looking at him and said, "What is it?" "Nothing," she said. "Everything." He smiled, and it was the same smile, the warm and crooked one that had started on the porch of Mrs. Hatch's boarding house with a comment about the curtain, and she thought she could go on looking at it for another 40 years and it would never stop doing what it did. "Lucy Morgan," he said, and the name held everything, the before and the after and the long, full middle. "It is Lucy Mercer now," she said mildly. "For the past 23 years. Both," he said. "You are both." She reached over and took his hand, and he closed his around hers, and they sat like that while the Kansas sky completed its extraordinary evening performance, going from gold to amber to the deep blue that she had put in a dress once because she could not bear not to have it near her, and then to the first clear darkness with the stars beginning, brilliant and numerous and close. And the ranch was quiet around them, and the cottonwoods moved in the warm night wind, and inside the house a baby slept and a daughter worked, and a son and his wife were finished with the barn chores and coming up the path, and Domingo's kitchen had a lamp burning low, and the grassland stretched away in every direction under the great sky, and all of it, every single piece of it, was exactly and precisely right. She had not wanted a big wedding. He had handled everything. And they had built, from that simple and honest beginning, a life so full and real and good that she sometimes, sitting on this porch in the evening light, had to simply stop and be still with the weight of how grateful she was for it, for the particular courage she had found on a November afternoon to stand under bare cottonwood trees and say yes, for the man who had asked her with his hat in his hands and his honest brown eyes and all the intention in the world, for the way the territory had received them both and given them back something neither had been brave enough to specifically ask for all of it, every single morning of it, from the curtain forward.